course, I'm going to start off with, what every person in Los Angeles is talking about right now and really wants the answers to why is crime, and specifically violent crime, rising here in Los Angeles?
Yeah, that is the most popular question being asked around our city and our county. And it's in response to a lot of images that we're seeing on our televisions and in our social media of aggressive robberies, burglaries, follow home robberies. A lot of terrible things are happening and they're being televised, so to speak, because there are cameras everywhere. It feels like crime is going up because crime is going up, and that's also reflected in the statistics that are generated. So why is it happening? Well, there are a lot of factors. There's no one factor that I could point to, but there are some things that are more obvious than others. We have begun a process of what's been called criminal justice reform. And criminal justice reform is a good idea because we haven't had a real reflection of our criminal justice system in quite some time. But the idea of reform and the way you go about it can sometimes be two different things. Well, the idea of reform can be great, but the way we seek to do it can cause unintended consequences and problems. And I think some of that is happening now. We had efforts to reform our prison populations to try to decarcerate our prisons and jails that started back as early as 2008. We've had a slew of changes in our laws over the last 10 years that reduced what were then felony crimes to misdemeanors. We've had the elimination of some crimes. And over the years, these laws have been passed, and I think now we're starting to see how they're affecting society. When you have reform, the laws don't make a change necessarily immediately. Sometimes it takes time to see those changes show up. And 10 years is about the period at which what I'll call, I hate these expressions, soft on crime and tough on crime, but they're useful, so I'll use them. When we see a softening on crime, the results of that softening will not show up the next day, but 5 or 10 years down the road. When we see tough on crime, we don't see the immediate results. We see it start to kick in 5 or 10 years down the road. So I think part of what's happening is a softening approach to crime, not just in the laws that are being passed, but also in societal attitudes. In addition to that, here in Los Angeles County, we have another obvious problem. We have a district attorney who has decided that he doesn't have to enforce the law, especially in the area of violent crime. He has taken it upon himself to ignore the law as it relates to important special allegations for the use of guns, for example. Guns are killing a lot of Los Angelenos, especially Black and Hispanic neighbors. But the district attorney's approach is, in his effort to fight incarceration, he'll trade off public safety for that. So, those are two of the more obvious reasons. There are undoubtedly other factors as well. The effect of COVID is also having an impact on the rise in crime, not directly, because I don't think one of the symptoms of the disease is that you somehow become more antisocial or more prone to commit crimes. But COVID has caused our penal institutions to release tens of thousands of inmates back into our communities before they've served their sentences. COVID has caused our local superior court to institute a zero bail policy that's resulting in the release of people within hours of being arrested. And many of those people are going back out onto the streets and committing more crime. So that's playing a role as well.
So from what you're talking about here, it's a multifaceted problem. It goes back many years ago, from policies that were made maybe 5 years ago, coupled with the current DA, Gascon, and now, the pressures of COVID as well. In your opinion, you're an expert on criminal justice and the law. How do people find a way to remedy what we're seeing?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we can do. One thing we can do is demand better leadership. And obviously, we need a new district attorney here in Los Angeles County because we have one that won't even follow the law, for goodness sake. So we need a new district attorney here in Los Angeles County. But this problem is not just in our county. We're seeing uptick in crime across our state. And a lot of that comes from legislation that's coming out of our state legislature. So we need to pick better leaders across the board, people who understand that the number one priority of local government is public safety. Our local governments are responsible for a lot of things that are important. We have a housing crisis, we have a perpetual education crisis, we have healthcare problems. But those things, as important as they are, and I want to stress, I believe they're really important, they all come behind public safety. Because if you're not safe in your homes, if you're not safe on your streets, if your children aren't safe in school, then what does the rest of it all matter? So we have to pick leaders who understand that public safety is the number one priority of local government. The other thing we can do personally and immediately is we have to do something that we haven't really had to do in the last 10 years here in Los Angeles County, because we've been living in a pretty low crime environment relative to the 90s and the first part of the 2000s. But we now have to start planning for our safety. We have to start thinking about filling up the car during the afternoon rather than waiting to go out at 11 o'clock at night and go to a gas station near on-ramp to a freeway. That's not a good place to be at 11 o'clock at night.
Right.
We have to start thinking about when are we going to go shopping? We have to start thinking about what are we going to wear when we go outside of our homes? I usually go for a light hike or a walk in the evening. Now I take off my watch. I recommend to my neighbors that they don't wear the jewelry that they typically wear throughout the day. You want to make yourself an unattractive target to people who are literally driving around the streets hunting for people to make victims out of. So those are some of the things we can do. Be alert, be aware. People already spend an enormous amount of money on private home security, whether it's cameras or alarms. Some people even get dogs for personal security. I love dogs, so that wouldn't be my number one reason for getting one. But it's a problem and it's expensive and it's getting worse and worse. We see, in some sense, we see a shift of responsibility from our government to us as individuals for our own safety. And that's not right. Government is getting out of the safety business and they're leaving it on us to take care of ourselves completely, cutting police budgets, putting people back out on the street before they're properly rehabilitated. We're bearing the burden of all of that. And again, that goes back to how I started. We need new leadership.
One thing specifically, you talked a little bit about statistics as well. According to LAPD, robberies are up 3.6% compared to last year. And we talked about this a little bit. The crimes seem to be a little bit more brazen, right? They're in the daytime. Usually you'd think of these crimes happening later in the evening in a bad area, but we're starting to see these crimes happen all across Los Angeles, specifically even in the wealthier, people would think safer neighborhoods. Why? This is a two-parter here. Why are crimes becoming more brazen, and why robberies?
Well, I think crimes are becoming more brazen because the message that's being sent, for example, by our district attorney, Mr. Gascon, and by our state legislature and governor generally, is that there are going to be fewer consequences for criminal behavior. I mean, the consequences have gotten so slight that some of these individuals don't care whether they get caught or not. Some of them understand that they'll be right back on the street before the sun sets. Some of them understand that even if they get successfully prosecuted in court, they're more likely to get a diversionary sentence or probation. So the message behind the kind of reform that we're getting is that there's less accountability, there are fewer consequences. It almost doesn't matter whether you get caught or not. That wasn't true 10 years ago. That's true today.
One of the policies of Gascon is a no bail policy, which through what we're talking about here seems to have played a large role in what we're seeing here in Los Angeles. Do you believe that that is true, that the no bail policy has impacted the way people are out on the streets?
Oh, absolutely. And there are actually two zero bail policies that are operating parallel to each other. One is a zero bail policy issued by our Superior Court. And that is most impactful right after a person is arrested. because when a person is arrested, one of the things that the arresting officer will do is look at the bail schedule issued by the Superior Court to determine if bail should be required and how much. Well, under COVID, and as you can imagine, the courts are trying to assist the community by facilitating fewer people being locked up in our county and local jails. So this is an emergency temporary order, but it does call as a general rule for no bail for felony and misdemeanors. And then it lists a lot of exceptions. And there are a lot of good exceptions. We would all agree, I think, with the exceptions on this list. But there are a lot of crimes for which people would normally be held. And these are the kind of crimes that we're seeing. Shoplifting, aggressive thefts are not on the list of exceptions. Perhaps if we had this problem back when the schedule was last revised, they would have included those things, and maybe they need to revise the list again or pull it back entirely. But I'm sure that's all going to depend on their assessment of what's going on with COVID in the county jails. And that stuff is beyond my knowledge. But I'm sure, I trust that the Superior Court judges are doing the right thing. But that is resulting in more people being on the street pre-trial than otherwise would be true. Alongside that, you have the district attorney who has a zero bail policy, just as not emergency, not temporary, but just as a standard policy. This is his ideology when it comes to pretrial detention. And it's far more lenient than the Superior Court's zero bail policy. It doesn't have as many exceptions. It would result in the release of even more people. And it is in some cases. So in terms of whether a person is out on the court's policy or the DA's policy depends on where the case is on the timeline. If a person is released right after arrest, it's probably the Superior Court's bail schedule. If it's at arraignment or later, it may be because of the DA's position on bail. And that can be a little bit complicated, but I hope I explained it well.
Yeah, I'm following you there. And continuing on the thought of Gascon, the DA at Los Angeles, he's actually your boss. So, that must be, an interesting relationship for you. But there was a first recall attempt for Gascon, and now they're going into their second recall attempt. Do you think this will be successful? And if so, why would it be any different?
Yeah, I'm more optimistic about this second effort. I think the first effort was launched way too soon. I don't think the timing was right. It was launched soon after Gascon was in office. People hadn't had an opportunity to assess him yet or see how his policies were affecting the larger community. So the timing is much better for this one. I also think they didn't have the right people involved in the first effort. There were people who had no experience in recalls, and other than making a lot of noise, they didn't know what to do next. So this one seems to be well managed. They've reported having a war chest, a fairly sizable war chest to use to go out and collect signatures. Just in my own experience, I'm getting a lot of phone calls from people who want to make a substantial contribution and want to know if I can put them in contact with the people who are running this effort. I myself am not a formal part of the recall effort, but I am doing everything I can to get the word out that a recall election is necessary.
Do you ever have these conversations with the DA yourself? Is there any part of you that's able to be directly involved?
Well, I've never had a conversation with Mr. Gascon about his policies. We talked briefly about a case, and it was cordial. It was fine. But I've never talked to him directly. I assume that he has seen, some of my public statements. I'm not the only one out there making these statements. There are a lot of people out there talking. I know he hears some of it because he's addressed some of his so-called critics in some of his own public statements. So it's not as if he's unaware that there's a substantial critique of his policies. And I have to say, this is not personal for me. Right. I don't know him, on a personal level. As far as I'm concerned, he may be a very affable guy, a good guy to be friends with. My criticisms have all been aimed at his policies, and they should be taken that way.
Definitely. And really to wrap it up here, I know we touched on safety as well. I think that's the number one thing, every person in Los Angeles is concerned about, aside from sort of the basics you talked about. Some people are contacting you as well, like, what do I do in this situation? Like, what do you recommend for people, to stay out of harm's way and to stay safe as possible during this time?
Yeah, well, we touched upon this a little bit earlier. We talked about planning. We talked about making yourself an uninviting target. The other things you can do is look into some sort of personal safety devices, pepper spray. I can't believe I'm even saying this, Look, I started in the DA's office in the late 90s when crime was quite bad. And the gang problem was out of control. Shootings were out of control. Murders were happening so fast that no sooner than detectives got assigned one, they got another one. And we ended up with a lot of cold cases that were solved later. I mean, that's how bad it was. If you're 30 years or younger, you don't even know what high crime is. You don't know what it feels like because you missed it. Maybe you were 10 years old back in the late 90s or 15. If you're 15, you probably were feeling it. But if you're 10, maybe too young to experience. So you got to be of a certain age to appreciate just how bad things can get. So I talk to younger people, they don't have the context, and I'm not knocking them like some people knock the millennials or Generation Z. I'm not doing that. But they don't have the experience of a crime rate that's 200% higher than it is right now. Some of us lived through it. Some of us fought it. We beat it down. We got to some of the historically lowest numbers of crime in this county's history, and we were maintaining until now. In the last 2 years, frankly, but especially this year, it's a different reality. And some of the younger people who've never experienced this before, they really don't understand what's going on. Well, it can get bad, and it can get a lot worse if we don't take measures to correct this course. It's just a course. We're off course. Efforts to reform the criminal justice systems that we have gone too far here in California. I appreciate the effort to lock up fewer people. That should always be a priority. But you can't do it at the expense of public safety. You can't trade off lower incarceration rates and then people end up in the ground 6 feet under. That's not a good trade-off. But I think we have some political leaders right now who are so focused on decarceration that they're unawares, they're tone deaf, or they just don't care about everything else that's going on around that effort.
Do you think there's a way to get back to that point where you kind of talk about in the late 90s, higher crime rate, and then you guys were able to bring it back down? Do you think there's a chance to get there again?
Oh, we absolutely will. It won't happen automatically. And it's not just, going to happen with the change of the direction of the wind. We have to make it happen. We have to show the political will to make it happen. As I said, we have to put leaders in office who understand the benefits of true rehabilitation, or what's sometimes now referred to as restorative justice, and public safety, that we can have both of those things, but we can't have one at the expense of the other.
I want to thank you again, Mr. McKinney, for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time. This is obviously a concerning subject, but happy to hear your professional thoughts on it and to be able to share that with others here in Los Angeles.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. And I've seen some of your interviews with some of the lawmakers around our community, your interview in DC, and I have to say that I think you're doing a great job, and congratulations to your platform, Erupt, for the good work that they're doing.